Winter, 1887 Upper Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory. A brutal cold rolls down from the Absaroka peaks long before the sun fully slips beneath the horizon. By dusk, the river has already begun to freeze, its surface turning black and glassy under the tightening grip of the Arctic air. The wind carries sharp grains of snow that move sideways across the valley, stinging exposed skin and scouring the faces of cabins half buried in the rising drifts. Inside one of them, small, narrow, and built with the plain, functional lines of a trapper's hand, an impossible warmth lingers. Not the kind that fades when a fire dies down, but a steady, even heat that fills the room the way dawn light fills a canyon wall. Elias Thorne, 42, weathered from years along the high trails, sits at his small table carving a replacement snare trigger. Behind him, the fire has been dead for hours, yet the air around him holds a quiet, room-temperature calm. A frantic pounding breaks through the storm. Caleb Dre, coat frosted white, breath shaking, shouts through the door. "Elias, my fire's dying, how are you still warm? You ain't even got flame in there." Elias rises slowly, expression unreadable. "Floor's heatin' the place," he says. "Not the fire." Beneath the floorboards lies a narrow, stone-lined trench, his heat ditch, mocked by half the valley all summer. They called it foolish, backwards, a grave for warmth. But tonight, as men burn through their last stacks of wood, Elias's hidden trench has already kept his cabin warm for 14 uninterrupted hours without a single glowing ember. July of 1887 arrived in the Upper Wind River Valley, the way it always did. Dry wind rolling through the sage, cottonwoods shimmering silver in the heat, and the high peaks sitting pale and distant against a washed-out sky. Most men spent those days splitting rails, patching, chinking, or hauling the last of the spring-cut timber while the sun was still kind enough to allow steady work. But Elias Thorne was doing none of those things. He was digging. Right in the center of his half-built cabin, under the bright Wyoming sun, he carved a narrow trench into the packed earth with the precision of a man shaping something far more delicate than a floor. Slow, steady strokes, deep, measured cuts, every shovelful placed aside neatly, as if the dirt itself had value and purpose. Caleb Dre noticed long before he intended to. He'd been on his way past with a bundle of green-cut poles when the sight of Elias, ankle-deep in a ditch inside a cabin frame, made him stop short. He leaned against a post and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Heat rises, fool. Digging a ditch to warm a cabin? That's backwards." His voice carried the easy confidence of a man repeating something everyone else already believed. And in a valley where winters bit deep and tradition passed from father to son without question, that was enough to draw a few more curious eyes. By midday, 3 trappers stood nearby, shading their eyes and trading smirks, while Elias continued shaping the trench, as though no one were there at all. They began calling it Thorne's heat grave, whispering it loud enough that Elias could hear, but quiet enough to pretend they weren't aiming the words at him. He felt no need to answer. The earth answered for him, cool, heavy, slow to change, exactly the kind of partner he understood best. May Dre approached later, while Caleb had wandered off to fetch water. She stood at the threshold, hands clasped, looking into the skeletal cabin frame. Her eyes followed the length of the trench, studying the careful spacing, the straightness of the walls. "Why in the center?" she asked softly. Elias paused only long enough to brush dirt from his palms. "Heat needs a heart to rise from," he said. "Place it anywhere else and it wanders." May nodded once, as though she'd expected nothing less from a man who lived half his life in the mountains, watching how cold behaved on rock faces and river cuts. She didn't mock him, and she didn't linger. But as she stepped away, Caleb intercepted her, irritation sharpening his features. "You help him build that foolish trench, you'll freeze come December," he warned, loud enough for Elias to hear. Tradition spoke through him, firm, unquestioning, and certain that heat belonged only in stoves and chimneys. Elias kept digging. By late afternoon, the trench extended the full length of the cabin's center line. He dropped to one knee and tested the depth against the reach of his hand, then checked the width by sight, adjusting a few edges until the walls were clean and straight. The earth around the trench felt cool even beneath the summer sun, a reminder of what winter would demand. He lined the first section with hand-picked riverstones, rounded, smooth, and heavy, each one placed deliberately. There was no rush in the way he worked. Heat, he knew, was a patient thing. You either learned its rhythm or you wasted it. By evening he stepped back, studying what others saw as a pointless ditch. But Elias saw something else entirely. a vessel, a reservoir, a foundation that would decide whether he froze or survived. And with the trench complete, he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked toward the river. The next step, sourcing the stones that would hold heat long into winter, had only just begun. None in the valley realized how important each stone choice would become when the first deep cold arrived. The Wind River ran low that summer, its channel braided into thin, cold ribbons that whispered over stone and sand. The snowmelt from the high Absarokas had already passed, leaving exposed gravel bars and wide shelves where the current slowed enough for a man to stand knee-deep without being pushed off balance. Elias Thorne knew this was the moment to gather what he needed, not firewood, not timber, but stones. He stepped into the shallows at dawn, boots sinking into the shifting grit beneath the water. The cold bit at his skin through the leather, but he welcomed it. The river revealed what the earth hid: weight, density, and the kind of stone that remembered warmth long after the fire faded. He worked in silence, running each stone through his hands, testing for cracks, chips, or the subtle layering that meant it would shatter under heat. Most he tossed aside with barely a glance. 2 ranch hands rode past on their way to check the grazing lines. One reined in, watching Elias lift stones one by one, examining them like a jeweler inspecting flawed emeralds. "He's picking rocks like they're gold nuggets," the man muttered, amused. Elias heard him but didn't look up. He rolled a smooth river stone in his palm, feeling its heft. Round stones heated evenly. Dense stones held their temperature. In riverbeds like this, where water had tumbled them for decades, the strongest pieces always revealed themselves through their shape. No sharp corners, no fissures. He placed the stone carefully into a burlap sack on the bank. A quiet rustle behind him made him turn. Maydre stood at the edge of the water, her skirt gathered in one hand to keep it dry. She didn't speak at first, only watched as Elias sifted through the stones with methodical patience. "Figured you'd need another sack," she said, holding out an empty one. Elias accepted it with a nod. May's presence wasn't intrusive. She had the rare ability to stand beside a person without crowding them. She crouched near the water, gathering a few stones herself, only the smoothest ones, the ones Elias would have chosen. May's help went unnoticed for only a short time. Caleb appeared farther upriver, his expression tightening as soon as he saw her kneeling there. "You help him build that heat ditch," he snapped. "You'll be sleeping in it with him." May stiffened, but Elias kept his focus on the river. Words tossed in anger rarely mattered. Winter sorted truth from falsehood better than any argument. As the sun climbed, he carried his growing pile of collected stones back to the bank. Once a small mound had gathered, Elias built a test stack on the shore. No grand fire, just a modest one, enough to saturate the stone cores. He sat beside it, watching the flames lick the rounded surfaces, listening for the dangerous pops or cracks that signaled hidden moisture or weak composition. But the stones held. No fractures. No failures. When the fire burned down to embers, he took out the small pocket thermometer he'd bought years earlier from a traveling peddler. An odd tool for a trapper, but one he trusted. He checked the stone's temperature as dusk set in. Then again after midnight. They remained warm long after the fire had died, far longer than any stove in the valley could maintain without constant feeding. By morning, frost clung to the grass, but the stones still radiated a faint, deep warmth. Caleb didn't understand it. The other ranch hands didn't care to. But Elias saw proof settled right there in the riverbank soil, the foundation of a heat source that wouldn't blink out when the wind turned murderous. If stones behaved like this in October, what would they offer in January? Late summer settled over the valley with a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed down on the land before the first autumn winds arrived. Elias Thorne used those quiet days to move from stone gathering to the more delicate work, the part that would decide whether his trench became a heat reservoir or a wasted effort. He knelt beside the trench inside the half-built cabin, tracing its length with a slow, thoughtful hand. The river stones he'd gathered sat in neat piles nearby, waiting for placement. But before they could serve any purpose, the fire channel needed to be constructed. A narrow, side-fed tunnel that would draw flame horizontally into the trench instead of straight upward. Most men in the valley had never seen heat work sideways. Fire, in their minds, belonged in stoves and chimneys, fed vertically, contained vertically, wasted vertically. But Elias had watched the way heat clung to canyon walls on cold mornings, how embers in buried fire pits stayed warm long after open flames died, and how narrow passages of earth channeled warmth better than wide, open hearths. He used flat stones first, laying them along the trench wall to create a firm base. Then he shaped an arch from thicker pieces, each stone chosen for its weight and curve. It had to be narrow enough to force the draft into a tight, fast pull, but tall enough to keep the channel from choking. When he placed the final stone across the top of the archway, he stepped back and studied the balance. Clean lines, tight joints, no failing edges. Caleb Dre wandered over just before noon, drawn by the rhythmic clack of stone against stone. He crossed his arms, watching Elias work without stepping inside. "You're burying the fire where it can't breathe," he said, voice carrying the same easy certainty he wore all summer. Elias didn't rush his answer. He fitted another stone against the arch, smoothing a small gap with packed earth. "It'll breathe through the draw I carve," he said quietly. "Heat'll go forward, not up." Caleb shook his head and walked off, muttering to himself about wasted time and the foolishness of sideways heat. His doubt became a kind of social gravity. Where he walked, others followed. Soon a few homesteaders took to whispering that Elias was dabbling in tricks learned from old country witch heating. Nonsense carried on the wind until it settled into every corner of the valley. Old Rourke arrived later with a bundle of kindling strapped to his back. A retired trapper with creased skin and slow, steady movements. He stood in the cabin doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Not stupid," he said at last. "Just old country smart." Elias offered him a nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more. Respect didn't need explanation between men who'd spent winters alone in the timberline, but time was slipping. Woodcutting season had begun, and neighbors spent long days gathering cords before the first ice formed. Elias should have been doing the same. Instead, he continued testing the channel, lighting small fires outside, watching how smoke traveled along prototype tunnels, adjusting the width of the inlet, narrowing the mouth by a finger's breadth at a time. By early September, the first cool nights arrived. Frost traced the edges of the sagebrush, a quiet warning from the mountains. Caleb passed by one evening and paused long enough to make his final judgment. "Come December, Thorne, you'll wish you'd built a real stove instead of that trench." Elias didn't answer. He had already seen what the valley had, not the channel pulled strong. The draft was clean. The stones held heat. Everything was ready. The first real test would come soon, and whether the valley mocked him or not, winter would deliver the only opinion that mattered. By early October, the valley had shifted. Nights grew sharper. Frost lingered longer on the grasses each dawn. The mornings carried that quiet, metallic chill that meant winter wasn't approaching, it was already watching. Elias Thorne waited for such a morning before testing the trench for the first time. He wanted real cold, not just a cool breeze. Something that would show whether the stones could hold enough heat to matter when the sun went down and the wind carved straight through a man's ribs. He began at dusk. The cabin stood roofed now, though the walls were still bare logs, with gaps he planned to chink before snowfall. Inside, the trench lay ready, lined with the river stones he had gathered, arched over by the narrow fire channel, packed tightly with earth and care. It looked unremarkable, plain even. But the best ideas often wore simple faces. He crouched at the trench's opening and fed in the first handful of dry kindling. The flame caught quickly. He added larger pieces, letting the fire draw itself down the channel. Within minutes, the flames began racing forward through the tunnel, licking the trench walls, saturating stone with stored heat. The cabin filled with a soft, low hum, the sound of rock taking in energy the way lungs take in air. May Dre appeared quietly at the doorway, her scarf pulled low against the cold. "Is it working?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't look up. Too early to know. For the next hour he monitored the trench, checking how the heat traveled along the stones, noting how long each section took to warm. He pressed his palm against different points, feeling the slow, predictable rise. Heat wasn't fast. It behaved with patience, creeping through mass before it dared enter the air. Outside, the valley lights dimmed as neighbors banked their stoves and settled in for the night. Inside Elias's cabin, the fire continued its steady run. After 3 hours, the stones glowed faintly behind their earthen cover, radiating through the floor planks overhead. A gentle warmth spread upward, thin at first, then gathering strength. The temperature rose slowly, but not in bursts the way stove heat did. No surges, no pockets, just a broad, even warmth that settled over the room like a blanket left in the sun. Near midnight, the fire finally tapered out. Elias let it die naturally, resisting the old frontier instinct to keep feeding it. This test depended on silence, on the absence of flame, on whether stone, and stone alone, could carry a man through the long hours. Caleb burst into the cabin shortly after, curiosity overpowering pride for a moment. He took one glance at the trench and laughed. "Looks hot down there," he scoffed. "Cabin's still cold, though." Elias didn't answer. There was no point in explaining a process still unfolding. Caleb left, shaking his head, satisfied he'd witnessed failure. But Elias stayed awake long after. Midnight passed. Then 1. Then 2. By 3, the fire had been dead for hours. The night reached its coldest point, the air outside dropping hard enough to make the cabin walls pop as the logs contracted. Just before 4, Elias sat up straight. The floor was warm. Not faintly. Not barely. Warm, like the surface of a sunlit stone. Heat rose in slow, steady waves through the planks, spreading evenly through the room. The trench hadn't lost its energy, it had only begun releasing it. He stepped outside, breath fogging instantly in the freezing air. When he returned, the contrast hit him like a wave. Warmth, true warmth, held without a single ember. If this was what the trench could do on a mild October night, what would it become when winter showed its true teeth? By December, winter no longer crept across the Wind River Valley, it ruled it. The cold front arrived with the abrupt finality of a door slamming shut. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the landscape brittle and still. Axes rang sharp in the frost as neighbors split wood at dawn, their breaths drifting in pale plumes that hung motionless in the dead air. Men who'd lived here their whole lives began measuring their wood piles with a nervousness they didn't speak aloud. Inside most cabins, the fight for warmth became a nightly struggle. Fires burned bright but faded quickly, heat escaping upward faster than anyone liked to admit. The moment a man stopped feeding his stove, the cold crept in along the floors, claiming rooms from the ground up. Families bundled in layers they had never needed before. Blankets stiffened with frost around their edges. Children woke shivering. Caleb Dre barreled into his own cabin one bitter evening with an armload of green wood far too wet for efficient burning, but all he had left. His boots tracked in snow, his voice rising in frustration. "We'll run out of wood 4 weeks' end," he snapped, voice cracking from the cold. May didn't answer. She was crouched near the stove, coaxing flame from the mix of half-dry logs. Caleb paced, glancing toward the shrinking stack outside. The cold thinned a man's patience faster than hunger ever did. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne's routine remained unchanged. Each dusk he loaded the trench with a measured armful of dry pine and juniper, letting the tunnel draw the flames deep into the stone bed. 3 hours of burn, no more, no less. Then he let the fire die. The trench did the rest. Heat rose through the planks in slow, pulsing waves, warming the cabin evenly through the silent hours of night. Even when the air outside dropped further, the earth beneath the floor released its stored warmth with steady resolve. Neighbors began noticing. Some whispered that Elias had a hidden fuel stash. Others hinted he was feeding his fire with something unusual. Rumors spread quickly when men were cold enough to believe anything. Someone confronted him outside the trading post one morning, breath freezing instantly in the wind. "You're hiding something, Thorne. No man holds warmth like that without extra burn." Elias only answered, "Just rocks and fire, same as you, only used smarter." Most dismissed the explanation. Understanding wasn't as easy as suspicion. By mid-month, the contrast grew even sharper. Elias's cabin held a steady 65-70 degrees Fahrenheit each evening. By dawn, it dipped only to the upper 50s, a warmth that felt almost decadent compared to the freezing floors and trembling stovepipes tormenting the rest of the valley. Caleb's cabin, though strongly built, fell near freezing each night. The stove simply couldn't keep pace with the cold that seeped through the walls and floors. Each sunrise found his family exhausted, the night spent battling drafts and dying flames. The physical toll showed, shoulders hunched, eyes reddened from smoke. Every man in the valley carried a stiffness born from too many nights waking to feed a fire that refused to stay alive. Then one morning, the sky darkened without warning. A wall of gray rose from the western ridge, thick as smoke and twice as ominous. The wind stilled something it only did before the worst storms. Old trappers recognized it instantly. A mass of Arctic air rolling in fast. Winter wasn't finished. It was only sharpening its teeth. The storm that now gathered would test Elias's trench far beyond anything he had planned, and it would push Caleb's family to the edge of survival. The storm arrived without hesitation, no slow buildup, no drifting flakes to soften the warning. One moment the valley was gripped by its usual December cold, and the next, a white wall swept over the land with a violence that felt almost deliberate. Winds screamed down from the Absarokas at more than 50 miles an hour, flattening sage and slamming loose snow into hard-packed waves that rolled across the ground like surf. Visibility vanished. Sound changed. The world turned into a shifting tunnel of pale, suffocating chaos. Cabins shuddered under the impact. Caleb Dre's home was one of the first to show signs of strain. The chimney icing began early thin crystals forming along the rim, then thickening with every gust of wind. Smoke that normally rose clean began to wobble, losing its upward pull. May fed the stove again, leaning close to coax the flames. But the draft stuttered, then sagged. Caleb rushed inside, snow coating his shoulders and beard. "May, the fire, it's dyin'." She saw it too. The smoke folding down, the flame shrinking in a suffocating swirl. The chimney was choking. The wind had turned the stovepipe into a cold sink, pulling heat backwards instead of drawing it up. Across the valley, the same thing happened. Stoves sputtered, fires struggled. Wind clawed at any exposed surface, stealing warmth faster than men could produce it. A dozen homes faced the same creeping dread, the realization that even a momentary lapse in vigilance could turn deadly. But Elias Thorne's cabin behaved differently. Just before the storm hit, he'd lit his trench fire with the same measured routine dry wood stacked carefully in the side channel, flames rushing forward into the stone-lined core. For 3 hours the trench filled with heat, the stones soaking in the energy, the way deep earth drinks the afternoon sun. Then, he let the fire die. When the blizzard slammed into the valley, Elias sat inside, sharpening a skinning knife, the warmth around him steady and even. Outside, the wind hammered at the walls, frost thickened on the window's edge, the sound of the storm roared like a living creature circling the cabin. Yet the air inside held firm. The buried trench protected its warmth from the wind. The earth around it insulated the heat, allowing almost no loss to the storm. And with no flame burning, there was nothing for the blizzard to choke, no chimney to clog, no draft to reverse. The heat rose gently, slowly, stretching into every corner of the room. By midnight, the full force of the storm was upon the valley. Families huddled under blankets. Fires failed. Frost began creeping onto interior walls, thin white veins branching outward across log surfaces where warmth couldn't keep up. In Caleb's cabin, the temperature dropped fast. His son whimpered from the cold, his breath forming clouds that hung in the air before drifting downward. The cold had turned their home into a hunting ground. Meanwhile, Elias checked his floorboards. They radiated a consistent heat far from hot, but steady enough to push back the biting cold with room to spare. The trench had been saturated hours earlier, and now it released its energy without interruption, unbothered by the storm raging only inches beyond the walls. Wind battered the roof. Snow piled high against the cabin sides. Somewhere in the distance, a tree snapped under the weight of the ice-laden gusts. It was the kind of night that erased tracks, swallowed sounds, and punished any mistake a man had made months earlier. And in that unbearable cold, Caleb Dre faced a decision no pride could soften: admit defeat, or gamble his family's lives on a fire that could no longer survive the storm. He hesitated only a moment. With frost forming inside his own walls and his son trembling from the cold, Caleb knew there was only one place left in the valley where warmth still lived: Elias Thorne's cabin. The storm did not ease as dawn approached. Instead, the wind sharpened, cutting across the frozen valley in long, punishing sheets. Snow hammered at the cabins in rhythmic bursts, piling high against every wall and window. Inside their home, Caleb Dre and May moved through the dim light with the slow, uncertain motions of people caught between fear and exhaustion. Their fire was gone. Not weakened, not faltering gone. The chimney had sealed itself with ice, turning the stove into a dead iron box. The cold had settled in with a kind of quiet cruelty, creeping down the walls, frosting the inside of the windows, filling every breath with a bite that stung the lungs. Caleb's small son curled near the stove, shivering violently beneath a pile of blankets. His breath came in shallow puffs that drifted slowly toward the floor. May knelt behind him, rubbing his arms, trying to coax warmth back into a body the cold had already claimed too much of. Caleb stood at the center of the cabin, eyes fixed on the frost spreading across the logs. A man could ignore a lot mockery, pride, a neighbor's clever idea he didn't understand. But he could not ignore the way the cold moved like a predator, nor could he ignore the truth he had fought all summer. Elias's cabin was still warm. Even during the storm, even after his own fire had failed, one fact gnawed at him with relentless clarity. Eli had built something different, something mocked, something strange, something that, in this moment, was keeping a man alive. Caleb swallowed against the knot in his throat. Pride tasted bitter. Helplessness tasted worse. He dressed in layers, wool shirt, canvas coat, scarf wrapped twice across his mouth. The air inside the cabin was so cold he could see frost forming on the outer layers only seconds after he put them on. May looked up at him, eyes hollow with fear. He hesitated, then nodded toward their shivering boy. "I'm going," he said quietly. The words came out rough, but not from the cold. From the realization that he was walking toward the one man he'd spent months ridiculing. He lifted his son carefully and wrapped him tight. The boy murmured but didn't fully wake. That scared Caleb more than the storm. The door resisted as he pushed. It was crusted with ice. When it finally swung open, a wall of white slammed against them. The world outside had vanished, swallowed in a roar of wind and driving snow. Caleb pulled the boy close, bowed his head, and stepped into the storm. The trek felt endless. Snow lifted off the ground in waves, making each step uncertain. He followed the memory of the path, not the sight of it. There was nothing visible beyond a few feet. Ice stung the exposed edges of his cheeks. He could feel the temperature dropping deeper with every gust, but he pushed forward, muttering to himself, to his son, to the storm. By the time he reached Elias's cabin, his legs felt wooden, his hands numb in the mitts. He lifted his arm and knocked once, twice more for his own sense of purpose than because he thought anyone would hear over the wind. The door opened immediately. Warmth rolled out like a breath. Elias stood there, lantern in hand, expression steady and unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this moment. From the first day, Caleb mocked the trench. Caleb's voice cracked despite himself. "Elias, help us, please." Elias stepped aside without a word. The warmth inside the cabin washed over them, gentle, even, unbroken. The kind of warmth that didn't come from flame but from stone and earth holding on to hours of captured heat. May rushed in behind them as Elias shut the door. The storm thudded against the logs outside, unable to penetrate the steady, radiant calm of the trench-heated floor. Elias knelt, checking the boy's breathing, then lifted a floorboard with a hook. The stones beneath glowed with stored heat, still warm 14 hours after the fire had died. Caleb stared, stunned, his breath shaking. "It shouldn't work, but it does," he whispered. The storm howled outside, a reminder of how close the valley sat to the edge of disaster. And as the floor radiated its warmth upward, Caleb understood what the others had never bothered to consider. Elias hadn't dug a grave for heat. He'd built a lifeline. When the storm finally broke, it broke all at once like a curtain yanked aside. The wind eased, the sky thinned, and the valley emerged from the white roar in slow, uncertain shapes. Smoke rose from only a handful of chimneys. Most cabins were silent, their roofs buried deep beneath sculpted drifts. Snow lay in tall, wind-carved ridges against the north faces of buildings, some reaching halfway up the doors. Elias stepped outside first. The cold had sharpened overnight, settling into the kind of stillness that made every sound brittle. The snow under his boots squeaked rather than crunched, a sign the temperature was still far below zero. Yet inside his cabin, the air had remained warm, steady, survivable. The trench stones beneath his floor still held a lingering heat, slow and generous. May emerged behind him, wrapped in a blanket, exhaustion etched across her face. Caleb followed, shoulders heavy, walking like a man who had been forced to shed something he'd clung to for too long. Their son, finally warm and breathing steadily, slept inside. Across the valley, doors began to crack open. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, blinking into the pale morning light. Some looked toward Elias's cabin with open curiosity. Others wore expressions closer to guilt. Frost clung thick to their own windows. Ice filmed their stovepipes. Many had been forced to sit awake all night, feeding weak fires that barely held back the cold. Word of what happened had already spread. One family, Caleb's, had spent the worst hours of the blizzard under Elias's roof, warmed not by flame but by a trench full of stones no one had believed in. A pair of brothers from farther down the valley were the first to approach. Their coats were stiff with frost, their faces drawn. One cleared his throat. "Elias, we heard what your place did last night. Mind showing us how?" The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of frontier humility, an admission that survival sometimes required setting aside pride. Elias nodded once. No flourish, no satisfaction, just a quiet acceptance of the role necessity had placed upon him. He lifted a section of his floorboards and revealed the trench. The stones were no longer hot, but they still radiated a faint warmth, proof enough of what they had endured. A small crowd formed, quiet, tense, full of the kind of attentiveness that only comes after a night spent on the edge of danger. Even those who had mocked him stood in the doorway, reluctant yet unable to stay away. Elias explained as simply as he worked. Stone choice mattered. Dense, smooth river stones held heat best. Layered stones cracked. Trench depth mattered too if it was too shallow. Heat bled upward too fast, too deep, and too much warmth sank into the earth. The side-channel firebox had to be narrow so the draft pulled straight through. The stones needed airflow pockets between them, or they smothered themselves. He showed them everything. No secrets, no pride. May watched him teach, understanding now what she had sensed months earlier, that Elias had not built the trench for praise or argument. He had built it because he saw the logic in it, the way heat moved, the way the valley winters punished anyone who failed to think ahead. Caleb stepped forward last, hat in hand. His voice was low. "I was wrong," he said, and loud about it. Elias met his eyes, not with judgment, but with the same calm he held while digging the trench in July. "Storm teaches what talk won't," he replied. By afternoon, Elias was walking between cabins, kneeling in snow to mark proposed trench lines, advising on stone placement, measuring drafts with a strip of charred cloth that fluttered in the wind. Families followed him like students behind a seasoned craftsman. The valley had lost some of its arrogance overnight and gained something rarer: shared purpose. Within weeks, 3 cabins had trenches of their own. Others stockpiled riverstones for spring work. The design spread up the valley as word reached neighbors who had endured similar cold, similar fear, and somewhere beyond the ridge, another settlement, one hit just as hard by the storm, sent a rider down asking a simple question. Is it true one man kept warm without a fire burning all night? The story was already traveling. Spring was still months away, but men were preparing for it differently now, shovels ready, stones collected, and a distant community waiting to learn what Elias had built in silence. When spring finally reached the Upper Wind River Valley in 1888, it came slowly melting the drifts inch by inch, loosening the ice from the riverbanks, revealing the scars the blizzard had carved across the land. Cabins bore the marks of the storm: warped boards, split chinking, chimney caps twisted by wind, but Elias Thorne's home emerged almost unchanged, warmed through the worst nights by nothing more than stone, patience, and a willingness to think differently. His trench was never meant to be a marvel. He hadn't built it to prove anyone wrong. He built it because he trusted the things a lifetime outdoors had taught him: the way heat settled, the way earth guarded warmth, the way stone remembered fire long after flames died. Engineers much later would call this principle thermal mass. Elias simply called it the warm ditch. Caleb Dre never forgot the night he carried his freezing son through the blizzard, and he never forgot his own words from summer: "You're digging a grave for heat." The phrase echoed differently now, softened by gratitude, reshaped by survival. That winter, Elias burned a third of the wood any neighbor did, and the valley, once quick to mock, had become a place where men asked questions first and laughed later. In the end, Elias's trench was more than a clever idea. It was a reminder of what frontier life rewarded: not stubborn tradition, but the courage to observe, experiment, and listen to the land itself. And now the question passes to you. If you lived in that valley, would you have mocked the trench or built one before the cold came?